The dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with bruised colors of lavender and charcoal, as if the land itself still wore the memory of last night's storm. Eliza Morgan stood on her porch, boots caked in mud, the chill of the morning biting through her worn flannel shirt. The world around her felt battered, heavy with the smell of wet earth and broken branches, every inch of her farm bearing the scars of nature's latest fury. The storm had come like a beast in the night, howling through the valleys, shaking the timbers of her old house, leaving her wide-eyed and sleepless beneath thin blankets. Now, in the cold hush after the tempest, everything felt impossibly still. She walked the perimeter of her land, her every step crunching over debris, splintered wood from the north fence, a twisted length of wire, whole patches of her vegetable garden washed away in the torrent. The barn roof still held, though several shingles were gone. She paused, surveying the battered field, her eyes lingering on the patch of ground where her late husband, Bill, used to plant corn each spring. He'd been gone 8 years now, leaving her with this stubborn, beautiful patch of Montana and memories that clung like burrs. Suddenly, the stillness shattered. A frantic, desperate neigh cut through the air, a sound raw with terror and pain. Eliza stiffened. The sound came from the north field, down near the old irrigation ditch. Her pulse jumped. For a split second, she thought of turning back, just letting the wild world take care of itself. But habit and heart pulled her forward. Her boots squelched through sodden grass as she hurried toward the noise, each step filling her with a growing dread. When she reached the field, she spotted Daisy Abbott. Barely 20, red hair wild beneath a yellow slicker, already running ahead, waving her arms. Daisy had lived next door all her life, as quick to laugh as she was to lend a hand. She'd been helping Eliza with chores since she was 10, a fixture on the Morgan farm, and more family than neighbor these days. Wyatt Cooper trailed behind, muttering beneath his breath. Wyatt was all edges and grit, close to 60, grizzled, thick-set, with hands like tree roots and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been Bill's oldest friend, then Eliza's after the world shifted. His loyalty was a quiet thing, solid as the mountains themselves. They converged at the edge of a wide, churned-up mud pit, one the storm had carved in the night, swallowing half the lower field. There, sunk nearly to its flanks, was a Mustang. Mud plastered its pale coat, which shimmered silver in the morning light, ghostly and strange. Its eyes, wide and wild, burned gold against the muck, rolling with panic. The horse thrashed, hooves flailing, but each movement dragged it deeper into the sucking, merciless mud. Its breath came in ragged gasps, nostrils flaring, body trembling with exhaustion and terror. For a long moment, no one spoke. Daisy edged closer, voice low, trying to soothe the frantic animal. Wyatt swore under his breath, studying the pit, measuring the danger. Eliza felt frozen, rooted by old wounds. Years ago, wild horses had been a part of this land. Her late son, Thomas, had loved them, chasing Mustang herds across the flats, sketching their shapes in the dirt. The memory cut sharp now, and she hesitated. The urge to flee tugging at her like a riptide. But Daisy's eyes flashed, fierce and determined, and she said without words what Eliza could not. "We can't leave him." A wind swept across the field, stirring the branches overhead, carrying with it the scent of wet sage and something older, almost electric. Eliza's heart hammered. She took a shaky breath and pushed back her fear. The horse's life, like so many things on this battered farm, now rested in hands that had lost so much, but still found the strength to reach out. one more time. The trio sprang into action, wordless and determined. Daisy, nimble and gentle, knelt by the edge, whispering steady nonsense, letting the Mustang hear her voice above its panic. Wyatt hustled to the truck, searching for ropes, muttering about the damned weather and the stubbornness of women and horses alike. Eliza, ignoring the ache in her old bones, studied the mud, her mind racing with plans and half-forgotten tricks from decades spent on this unforgiving land. The storm might have broken fences and scattered dreams, but it hadn't beaten them yet. With every breath, every movement, Eliza felt the old stubbornness rising inside her, a refusal to let fate win, a promise she'd made to herself long ago. Even now, as the morning sun glimmered weakly through broken clouds, painting the world with pale hope, she knew that some things, like life and land and wild mustangs, could only be saved by those willing to fight through the darkness and reach for the light. Mud sucked at boots and hands as the morning grew brighter, the storm's aftermath turning the earth into a living, shifting trap. The wild Mustang, Ghost, as Eliza already called him in her mind for that pale, spectral coat, struggled with a desperate strength, but exhaustion dragged at his body. The pit's edge was slick, the mud deep and heavy, threatening to swallow anything or anyone who dared get too close. Wyatt returned with an old harness, its leather cracked from years in the barn, and several coils of rough rope. He grumbled as he worked, but his hands were sure, every knot and loop a testament to decades spent wrangling cattle, patching fences, and surviving whatever the Montana land threw at him. Daisy hovered at Ghost's head, her words a quiet hum meant to cut through panic and fear. The young woman's hands trembled as she stroked the horse's neck, but she pressed on, refusing to let her nerves show. Eliza stepped closer to the mud pit, boots sinking, her heart thumping. The Mustang's golden eyes flashed, wild and suspicious. Old instincts from her youth returned, memories of leading frightened animals to safety, of trusting in patience and courage rather than brute force. She felt the ache of her losses, her husband's death, the emptiness left behind by her son's accident, but now she channeled it into action, refusing to let grief freeze her. The mud clung like hands, cold and relentless. With every movement, Ghost threatened to sink deeper, his sides heaving. Eliza waded in, ignoring the chill and the risk. Her hands reached for the harness Wyatt tossed her, looping it carefully around the horse's chest and neck. Each touch sent Ghost into fresh panic, his muscles straining against her. Daisy's words wove a counterpoint, soft and soothing, buying Eliza the seconds she needed to work. The three of them moved as one, Wyatt pulling with all his might, Daisy steadying Ghost's head, Eliza coaxing the terrified animal forward inch by inch. Mud splattered across faces and arms, boots slipped and knees buckled, but they refused to give up. Ghost's legs flailed, hooves slapping the surface, every movement a risk that the horse might give up or injure himself in the struggle. As Eliza reached beneath the horse to secure the last loop, she felt something sharp cut into her palm, a rock or a broken branch buried in the muck. She winced, but held on, feeling blood mingle with the mud. She gritted her teeth, refusing to let pain distract her. The memory of her son's laughter urging her to keep going. Daisy's voice never wavered, and even Wyatt, silent now, pulled harder, his breath coming in grunts. With one final, concerted effort, they heaved together. Ropes creaked, muscles screamed, and for a moment it seemed the mud would win. But Ghost's spirit was not yet broken. With a mighty surge, the Mustang lunged forward, hooves finding firmer ground. Eliza staggered back, her body aching and soaked to the skin. Wyatt's arms shook from effort, and Daisy nearly collapsed in relief, tears cutting clean tracks through the mud on her cheeks. Ghost stood, sides heaving, trembling with exhaustion and fear. Mud coated every inch of his coat, hiding all but the ghostly shimmer of white and those piercing golden eyes. For a long moment, he seemed frozen, an apparition caught between worlds, before he let out a long, shuddering breath. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet grass and broken earth, and in that instant, Eliza knew they had done something miraculous. Wyatt tossed a blanket over the horse's back and clapped a muddy hand on Eliza's shoulder. Daisy looped her arm through the Mustang's makeshift halter, gently coaxing him forward. Together, they led Ghost across the battered field toward the barn. Every step was slow, careful, the Mustang's legs shaking beneath him, but Daisy never let go. The barn door stood open like a promise of safety, warm yellow light spilling across the threshold. Inside, the world changed. The storm's memory faded beneath the familiar scent of hay and the muffled sound of pigeons in the rafters. Daisy guided Ghost to a waiting stall, fresh straw rustling under his hooves. Eliza followed, wiping mud from her brow, her injured hand throbbing, heart swelling with a complicated pride. Wyatt hung back, leaning against a post, silent as ever, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. Eliza watched as Ghost finally lowered his head, drinking deeply from the water bucket Daisy placed before him. The horse's flanks shivered, nostrils flaring, but the wild panic had faded, replaced by wary exhaustion. In the light, his coat gleamed a pale silver white, ghostly and beautiful despite the mud and scars. Those golden eyes flickered between trust and suspicion, as if weighing the souls of the humans who'd risked so much to save him. She reached out, her injured hand hovering above his neck, remembering the horses from her past, the son she'd lost, and the stubborn will that still drove her every day. In a quiet voice, she spoke the name aloud for the first time, Ghost, a name for the spirit that refused to be broken, a living reminder of everything she had lost, and everything she was determined to save. Outside, the world still bore the wounds of the storm, but inside the barn, hope flickered like a lantern in the darkness. Eliza felt it settle deep inside her, warm and persistent. They had saved Ghost, but perhaps in some small way, he had saved them too. The storm had changed the shape of everything, leaving scars both seen and unseen. Ghost, the rescued Mustang, lay on trembling legs in the far stall, head drooped low as if weighed down by the memory of the mud pit. Sunlight filtered through the old barn's warped planks, catching the silver sheen of his coat and lighting up the haunted gold in his eyes. All morning he'd refused food, only half-heartedly sipping water when no one was watching, as if he couldn't quite trust the world he'd been dragged into. His flanks still heaved from exhaustion and fear, and his silence filled the barn with a sense of reverence and fragile tension. Eliza moved about her chores, her wounded hand wrapped tightly in a strip of linen. Every time she caught a glimpse of Ghost, a pang of memory gripped her. She hadn't allowed herself to think of Thomas, her son, for years, not really. But now, as the wild Mustang lay broken and watchful in her barn, pieces of the past crept back in, threading themselves into the present whether she wanted them or not. She remembered the boy Thomas had been, quick-footed and bright-eyed, obsessed with the Mustangs that roamed the outer fields. He'd spent afternoons sketching them, always chasing the elusive beauty of wild freedom. Even as a child, he'd felt a pull towards things that couldn't be tamed. Eliza had watched him from the kitchen window, a knot of worry always tightening in her chest. She'd lost him to the same land that had taken her husband, and though years had passed, grief had set like stone beneath her ribs. Wild horses had become a symbol of that pain, and in the quiet moments she sometimes hated them for it. Now, with Ghost stretched across her straw, she felt the old ache grow sharper. She wanted to keep her distance, to harden herself against hope. But something about the Mustang, the stubborn shimmer in his eyes, the way he refused to surrender, kept drawing her in. Daisy, young and undaunted, came by just after noon, her arms full of salves and clean towels. She greeted Ghost with a gentle voice, her movements careful and respectful, as if tending to some delicate secret. She talked about her dream, her eyes alight with the kind of fire Eliza recognized from her own lost youth. Daisy spoke of turning the barn into a sanctuary, a place where wild horses could find refuge instead of running from men with ropes and guns. The idea seemed impossibly large, almost naive, but Eliza envied her for it. To believe in new beginnings after everything the world had thrown their way felt like a kind of magic. The day passed in slow waves. Daisy kept busy tending to Ghost's wounds. She washed the mud from his flanks, fingers quick and sure, eyes scanning for cuts and bruises. She wrapped his swollen legs and checked his hooves, her patience infinite. Ghost never lashed out, but neither did he relax. His wariness was a constant presence. Like a tension in the air that never quite faded, Wyatt came and went, patching up the barn roof and reinforcing the doors. He worked in silence, though his gaze lingered on Ghost with something like old regret. He never said much about the past, but his presence was steady, and his actions spoke of loyalty and quiet kindness. Outside, the wind had settled, but the land was restless. As night crept in, a hush fell over the fields. The old barn stood as a lone sentinel, its windows glowing with warm light, the world outside still healing from the chaos of the storm. Later that night, as Eliza tried to sleep, strange noises echoed from the hills. At first, it was only a distant whinny, then the faint drumming of hooves across wet earth. The sounds seemed to gather in the darkness, growing louder, then fading again, as if a herd of ghosts was circling the edges of her land. Even the dogs in the valley below joined in, their howls rising to meet the chorus of wild mustangs hidden beyond the moonlit horizon. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it a mixture of fear and anticipation. Eliza lay awake, the ache in her hand a dull throb. She remembered Thomas sitting cross-legged on the porch, drawing pictures of the wild horses and dreaming of a world where nothing had to be broken to be free. She wondered if he would have understood Ghost, if he would have seen hope instead of heartache. The night pressed on, filled with restless dreams and the distant calls of wild things. Ghost did not sleep. Instead, he stood in his stall, ears flicking at every sound, eyes shining in the darkness. Eliza watched him from the doorway, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just on her land, but deep inside herself as well. The storm had left wreckage in its wake, but in the ruins, something old and powerful was beginning to stir. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if a broken woman and a wounded Mustang could heal each other, or if the ghosts of the past would win out in the end. As dawn crept over the battered land, a chill clung to the morning air. Eliza stepped outside, the old wooden boards of the porch creaking beneath her boots. The storm's scars still marred her property, but something deeper tugged at her attention. The barn seemed to breathe in the blue morning light, silent and mysterious, holding its secrets behind weathered walls. The world was not quite right. Even before coffee, Eliza spotted them, hoofprints pressed deep into the mud that ringed the barn. Not just ghosts, but a dozen more, weaving and circling, as if a whole herd had drifted silently across the property in the night. She knelt to inspect them, feeling the impressions with her fingers. Some were small, delicate as a child's palm, others wide and strong. She glanced at the horizon, half expecting to see movement, but the fields were empty, shrouded in mist. All around, the ranch dogs howled, restless and unsettled. From far off came the echo of whinnies, strange and wild, voices of the hills carried down to her on the wind. The Mustangs, it seemed, had been drawn to something, or someone, on her land. The feeling was electric, every hair on her arms rising with the sense that she was being watched by eyes she couldn't see. Inside the barn, Ghost stood near the back of his stall, posture rigid, ears pricked forward. He hadn't touched the feed Daisy left the night before, but he watched Eliza with an intensity that bordered on supernatural. The golden shimmer of his eyes seemed to flicker in the dimness, both a challenge and a plea. Daisy arrived, breathless and eager, her gaze sweeping over the hoofprints before she joined Eliza in the barn. She marveled at the mystery, a spark of excitement in her voice as she speculated that the wild Mustangs were searching for their lost companion. Eliza listened, her face unreadable, but inside she felt the old ache returning, loss, regret, a wound that refused to close. Wyatt showed up late, stomping mud from his boots, a grumble in his throat. He didn't trust the signs. Years on the land had taught him that when wild animals came close, it often meant trouble was brewing. He prowled the perimeter, checking fences, his sharp gaze scanning for threats, convinced that the howls and hoofbeats spelled danger rather than hope. That day the air seemed thicker, as if the world itself was holding back some ancient truth. Eliza moved through her chores with a strange sense of vigilance. The barn felt different, charged, almost sacred. Shadows flickered in the corners, and once she could have sworn she saw movement in the fields beyond, dark shapes darting between clumps of sagebrush and willow. Each time she glanced over her shoulder, she felt the land watching her, judging her. Despite the tension, Daisy's optimism was relentless. She spoke of the sanctuary again, describing her vision in breathless detail. She dreamed of building a place where wild horses could roam safe from government roundups and cruel men. Her words painted pictures in the dusty air, herds running free, children coming to learn, the land restored to something like grace. Eliza listened, half wanting to believe, half afraid of the hope that crept in through Daisy's conviction. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of bruised peaches, and the wind rattled the barn's tin roof. Wyatt paced, uneasy, keeping a rifle close by, more out of habit than true fear. Ghost remained on edge, every muscle taut, the wildness in his blood close to the surface. Eliza found herself standing alone by the barn door, lost in thought. She traced the hoofprints in the yard with the toe of her boot, trying to decipher their message. She wondered about the Mustangs out there in the hills, what drew them to her land, what ancient stories they carried in their bones. The ache of her own losses throbbed in rhythm with the land's mysteries. She felt guilty for what had happened on her ranch years ago, and for the things left unsaid to her son. Regret mingled with a flicker of hope, an almost unbearable longing for something new. something that could heal old wounds. Night came early, blanketing the ranch in velvet blue. The dogs fell silent, as if sensing that something important was about to happen. As Eliza closed the barn door for the night, she paused, hand resting on the latch. She looked up at the sky, streaked with stars, and felt the weight of time pressing down on her. Somewhere out there, the wild herd waited, drawn by the presence of one of their own, and perhaps by something else. Perhaps they too carried wounds, and were searching for healing in the shadow of the storm. In the hush, Eliza listened to the whispers of the past, the calls of the wild, and the quiet, persistent hope that maybe, just maybe, things could still change. Dawn emerged slowly, bathing the battered fields in shifting hues of mist and gold. Eliza rose before the sun, compelled by a restless energy she hadn't felt in years. She could sense something gathering, an anticipation woven into the air itself, as though the land was waiting for a sign. The storm's devastation still scarred her property, but this morning there was something different, a tension, almost electric, that made the hairs on her arms stand up. A low fog blanketed the earth, softening the sharp lines of broken fences and ruined crops. In this eerie silence, Eliza moved with cautious purpose, her boots sinking in dew-soaked grass. Daisy was already in the barn, tending to Ghost. The Mustang, restless and wide-eyed, shifted his weight nervously, the tension in his muscles echoing the wildness that hummed just beyond the walls. Even Wyatt, ever the skeptic, was more alert than usual as he circled the outbuildings, his eyes scanning the horizon for trouble. Then, as the first light filtered through the fog, something remarkable happened. From the far side of the property, near the edge of the old cottonwood grove, a procession of wild Mustangs emerged. The herd moved as one, spectral forms slipping through mist and shadow. At their head, a regal black mare strode with quiet authority, her mane rippling like dark silk. Behind her trotted several sturdy colts, their coats dappled with the dust of long travel, their eyes wide with curiosity and wariness. Eliza felt rooted in place, watching the herd approach. The world seemed to hold its breath. The Mustangs moved closer, hooves muffled by soft earth, until they circled the barn in a ritual-like dance. Their nostrils flared, picking up the scent of their lost companion. The black mare tossed her head, issuing a silent command that sent the colts fanning out in a wide arc. The horses didn't appear fearful. Rather, they carried themselves with the quiet dignity of creatures who had survived much and who understood the rules of the land. Then Eliza saw it, a small figure, golden-eyed and bright amidst the mist. The foal was barely more than a shadow at first, but as it stepped forward, its coat shimmered with the same uncanny pallor as Ghost's, though flecked with gold and cream along the spine. The foal paused near the fence, lifting its head and locking eyes with Eliza. In that gaze was an intelligence, a question, and a challenge that reached deep into her bones. As the herd settled, circling the barn, Ghost's demeanor shifted. He lifted his head higher, nostrils flaring, muscles bunching beneath his pale coat. His ears flicked forward. And for the first time since his rescue, he looked less like a ghost and more like a leader, caught between two worlds. Daisy, standing by his side, whispered encouragement, but even she fell silent as the energy in the air grew heavy with meaning. Eliza watched, memories pressing in. The sight of the golden-eyed foal brought back a flood of images. Her son Thomas, standing at this same fence, sketchbook in hand, eyes wide with wonder, as he watched the wild herds thunder across the prairie. Thomas had believed there was magic in Mustangs, that they carried the secrets of freedom in their blood. His faith had been pure, untouched by loss, and his dreams had once felt boundless. But the return of the herd dredged up pain, too. Eliza remembered the day tragedy struck. A chase gone wrong, Thomas riding too close, a spooked Mustang veering into his path. The accident had been senseless, the aftermath a wound that never fully closed. For years, Eliza's grief had hardened into resentment, not only toward the wild horses, but toward hope itself. She blamed the Mustangs for what she had lost, building invisible walls between herself and the wildness her son had loved. Now, standing at the fence, confronted by the living embodiment of her memories, Eliza's anger and sorrow threatened to consume her. She gripped the worn wood so tightly her knuckles blanched. The foal's gaze never wavered, its eyes as deep and knowing as the prairie sky. For a heartbeat, Eliza felt as if she were standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, a threshold between regret and forgiveness. The black mare moved closer to Ghost, touching noses through the slats of the fence. The other Mustangs mirrored the gesture, forming a living circle around the barn. The ritual had the solemnity of a homecoming, yet also the wildness of a challenge, as if the herd was asking Ghost, and Eliza herself, whether they truly belonged. The sun crested the hills, burning away the mist and bathing the world in fierce new light. Eliza let the warmth settle on her face, letting herself feel the ache and the hope mingling in her chest. She knew the old wounds wouldn't heal overnight, but as she watched the golden-eyed foal stand tall by the fence, she sensed the possibility of something new, a future not bound by loss, but by the courage to remember and to try again. Days after the gathering, the land felt haunted by memory. The Mustang herd had retreated to the shadowy edges of the property, visible only as fleeting shapes moving through distant fields. Ghost remained in the barn, restless but recovering, and the golden-eyed foal would sometimes reappear at the fence line, curiosity overcoming caution, watching Eliza's every move. It was as if the land itself was urging her toward something unfinished, something long ignored beneath layers of grief and time. Eliza spent her hours mending what she could. Every chore seemed heavier than before. She tried to focus on practical things, fixing fences, salvaging what the storm hadn't ruined, but her mind drifted constantly. Daisy's sanctuary dreams lingered in the air, echoing with possibility, but Eliza felt tangled in her own past, haunted by images of Thomas, his laughter mixing with the wind, his absence a constant ache. One afternoon, as sunlight glared down through shifting clouds, Wyatt arrived to help clear debris from a far corner of the property, the part no one visited anymore, where old outbuildings slumped like ghosts in the tall grass. The storm had uprooted a gnarled cottonwood, exposing dark, churned earth beneath its roots. Wyatt grumbled as he hacked at twisted branches, but his movements slowed as his boot struck something solid hidden in the muck. He crouched down, brushing aside dirt and leaves, and uncovered a half-buried wooden box. Its lid was rotted, but as he pried it open, the stench of old death seeped into the air. Eliza knelt beside him, her stomach twisting as Wyatt pulled out a bundle of weathered metal tags, small, stamped with numbers and government seals. There were more boxes nearby, some cracked open by the storm, their contents scattered across the roots. Eliza recognized the shape of bones, the delicate arcs of hooves, the broken fragments of Mustang skulls. A cold dread settled over her. She remembered whispers from her childhood, rumors about wild horse roundups, but her family had never spoken of it directly. Here was proof. Government tags, remains from a culling program decades past. The ranch she had inherited, the land her family had cherished, had been part of a brutal history. The Mustangs had once been rounded up, slaughtered, and buried in secret, their memory hidden beneath years of silence and denial. Wyatt stood up, his face grim, brushing dirt from his hands. There was nothing to say that would soften the truth. For a moment, the weight of the past pressed down on both of them. Centuries of conflict between people and wildness, all the broken promises and quiet grief. Eliza stared at the graveyard of bones, feeling a strange blend of anger and shame. She wondered how much her family had known, how much they had chosen to forget. It struck her that her own bitterness toward the Mustangs was a kind of inherited guilt, a refusal to reckon with what the land itself remembered. Her anger at the horses had always been tangled with her sorrow for Thomas, but now she saw another layer, the sorrow of the land, bearing scars left by human hands. Daisy found them there, standing amid the ruined boxes. The young woman's eyes widened as she took in the scene. Without flinching, she reached out and touched one of the metal tags, tracing the worn numbers with her thumb. Daisy's voice was gentle but urgent as she told Eliza that these remains couldn't be hidden anymore. The truth, no matter how ugly, had to be faced. The lost Mustangs deserved to be remembered, not buried in silence. A hush fell over the three of them. Wind rattled the broken limbs overhead, and somewhere out in the fields, a wild horse called, its voice carrying across the distance like a mournful hymn. The world felt suspended, caught between old sins and the possibility of forgiveness. Eliza knelt beside the grave, her injured hand pressing into the dirt. She whispered a promise, barely audible, to do better, to honor what had been lost. She thought of Thomas, of his belief in the wild and the beautiful, and wondered if she could be the kind of person he'd wanted her to be, brave enough to face hard truths, strong enough to start again. They gathered the remains with quiet reverence, piling the bones and metal tags with care. The past couldn't be changed, but perhaps it could be healed, one act of remembrance at a time. As dusk fell and the wind picked up, Eliza felt the weight inside her begin to shift, not gone, but lighter, transformed by the promise of honesty and the hope for a different future. That night, the land slept uneasy, but the old wounds had been uncovered, exposed to the cleansing air. In the barn, Ghost lifted his head, as if sensing the change, his golden eyes shining with something almost like trust. Night gathered early on the ranch, the sky settling into a deep indigo while a cold wind whispered through the battered cottonwoods. Inside the old farmhouse, Eliza sat hunched beside the fireplace, the orange glow flickering across the weathered lines of her face. The discovery in the far field had changed something fundamental inside her. Guilt lay heavy on her shoulders, pressing down like a weight that grew with every breath. She clutched Thomas's old bandana, worn thin by years and tears, turning it over in her calloused hands as if searching for answers in its faded blue cloth. Ghost's presence had transformed the barn, but his spirit had also unsettled the shadows in Eliza's heart. She couldn't forget the bones, the government tags, the proof that her family's land had once played a part in an old, silent massacre. She saw again her own hands blaming Mustangs for loss, hiding pain behind bitterness. The Mustangs outside, the golden-eyed foal at the fence, the restless energy in the barn, All these things had forced open the wounds she'd tried to bury for so long. The fire crackled and spit, casting restless patterns on the floorboards. Eliza felt small beneath the gaze of her ancestors and the memory of her son. Grief and regret tangled inside her, a storm of memories too powerful to outrun. She remembered Thomas's laughter, how his dreams had been filled with wild horses, freedom, and hope. She remembered the promise she'd made to herself after his death, to never let herself feel so deeply again, to close the door on loss before it could break her twice. Yet tonight, that promise felt like a chain binding her to the past. She stared into the fire until her eyes burned, longing for release. A noise drifted in from the barn, a soft shifting, the scrape of a hoof on old planks. Eliza rose, pulling her coat tight around her, and stepped into the cold night. The world outside was silent but alive, moonlight painting the fields with a ghostly silver. Her boots crunched over frosted grass as she crossed the yard, the barn looming before her, both sanctuary and confessional. Inside, Ghost stood in his stall, head raised, ears twitching toward her. The Mustang's eyes glowed gold in the lantern light, unblinking and unafraid. Eliza paused at the gate, the silence between them deep as the prairie itself. She leaned on the wooden post, Thomas's bandana clutched tight, the old ache throbbing in her chest. For a long while, she simply watched Ghost breathe, saw his flanks rise and fall, the scars of his ordeal still visible beneath his shimmering coat. She felt her pain and anger loosening, dissolving into the cold air. Ghost's presence was steady, wordless, full of an old wisdom that had nothing to do with humans and everything to do with survival. Unable to hold back any longer, Eliza stepped forward and knelt by the gate, resting her forehead against the rough wood. Memories surged. Thomas's drawings, his boots beside the back door, the sound of his voice in the dawn. She wept, quietly, tears leaving hot tracks on her cheeks, hands gripping the bandana so tightly the fabric twisted. Ghost shifted closer, his breath soft and warm against her arm. He reached his head over the stall gate, golden muzzle nudging her shoulder with a gentleness that surprised her. It was an invitation, an act of grace. Eliza lifted her head, meeting Ghost's eyes. In that moment, something between them cracked wide open, a connection made not of words, but of shared wounds and the stubborn will to endure. She whispered apologies, to Ghost and to herself, words barely audible in the hush of the barn. The weight inside her eased, a rush of forgiveness flowing through old scars. She realized she'd blamed the horses because it was easier than facing the truth. Loss is the price of love, and refusing to feel was no protection against heartbreak. Thomas had known that. He'd chased the wild, knowing it could never be caged. Outside the barn, the Mustang herd had gathered again, their silhouettes etched in moonlight at the edge of the pasture. They stood in a silent circle, heads raised as if in vigil, witnesses to the quiet reckoning inside the barn. Daisy and Wyatt watched from a distance, sensing the shift in the air, but not intruding. The land seemed to hold its breath. A sacred pause as old grief was laid bare. Eliza pressed her face against Ghost's neck, breathing in the wild, earthy scent of him, feeling something new stir within her, a hope as fragile as dawn, but real and persistent. The Mustangs outside waited, not as specters of loss, but as keepers of memory and forgiveness. The fire in her heart was different now. It no longer burned with anger, but with the courage to face the past and build something better. She stood, bandana still in hand. and looked out into the dark. The wild herd shimmered under the stars, their presence a reminder that healing is possible, even for the deepest wounds. Dawn broke gentle over the ranch, washing the world in pale rose and honeyed gold, dissolving the last traces of the long, haunted night. The air was crisp and clear, sharp with the scent of damp earth and wild sage, but the weight that had pressed on Eliza's chest for so many years felt lighter, almost as if the land itself had shifted, finding a new balance after so much turmoil. She woke before the sun, moved by something she couldn't name. The old farmhouse felt different, the corners no longer filled with shadows. Eliza pulled on her boots, wrapped herself in Thomas's bandana, and stepped outside. The first light spilled over the barn, illuminating a world touched by possibility. Every leaf, every blade of grass seemed sharper, the air alive with potential. In the barn, Ghost was already awake. He stood tall in his stall, muscles healed and coat clean, a living specter now restored to strength. The wildness in his eyes remained, but it was tempered now by something quieter, an acceptance, a peace earned through suffering and survival. Eliza's heart thudded with mixed emotions: pride, sadness, a fierce gratitude for the chance to witness his transformation. She opened the stall door, and Ghost stepped out without hesitation. He paused in the aisle, nostrils flaring, ears flicking at every sound. Daisy stood nearby, quiet and reverent, as if she sensed that something sacred was about to happen. Wyatt waited at the barn doors, arms folded, watching with an expression that mixed skepticism and awe. The moment Ghost left the barn, the air seemed to shift. From the misty edge of the pasture, the wild herd approached, silent as spirits, hooves barely disturbing the dew-laden grass. The black mare led the way, head held high, followed by the younger colts and the golden-eyed foal. They moved in a formation that was more than instinct. It felt ceremonial, a ritual rooted in the bones of the land and the memory of generations. Ghost walked to meet them, his body fluid and powerful. As he reached the herd, the Mustangs gathered around him, touching noses in silent greeting. The black mare pressed her muzzle to his flank, and the others followed, forming a living ring. Eliza watched, transfixed, as the ritual played out. A farewell, a welcome, an ancient act of belonging. The golden-eyed foal, Echo, lingered behind. He stood at the fence, watching Eliza with the same unwavering gaze that had unsettled her days before. She knelt, stretching out her hand. Echo stepped closer, the early sun painting his coat with gold and cream, and nuzzled her palm. In that simple gesture, Eliza felt something pass between them, a promise, an unspoken understanding that life could begin again, no matter how many times it had been broken. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry piercing the quiet morning. Eliza looked up, following its flight, and felt the old fear loosen its grip. She thought of Thomas and Bill, of the generations who had loved and lost on this land, and realized that her story, and theirs, had changed. There was no erasing the scars, but now, at last, there was room for hope. The Mustang herd, their ritual complete, turned toward the open prairie. The black mare led the way, Ghost moving at her side, strong and proud once more. The others followed, their bodies merging with the dawn-lit mist, wild and free. Eliza watched them go, her heart swelling with sorrow and joy in equal measure. She knew that Ghost's place was with his own kind, that the greatest act of love was letting go. Echo hesitated at the fence, torn between two worlds. Eliza stroked his neck, murmuring words only the land could hear, and after a moment, the foal stepped back, joining the herd, but glancing over his shoulder as if to say goodbye. Daisy slipped her arm around Eliza, and Wyatt stood silent, hat in hand. The three of them watched as the Mustangs vanished into the hills, their hoofbeats a fading echo, a song of survival and freedom that belonged to the ages. The hawk soared above, a living symbol of blessing, casting its shadow across the fields as the world shifted into a new chapter. Eliza stood by the fence long after the herd was gone, her fingers pressed to the worn wood. The silence was deep but not empty. She breathed in the morning, her grief softened by forgiveness, her hope restored by the wild magic that had come and gone in her barn. The land was not healed, not completely, but it was alive again, and so was she. In the days that followed, ghosts returned to the wild. Something new took root in the quiet fields and battered fences of Eliza's ranch. For the first time in years, the sorrow in the air seemed less heavy. A kind of hush lingered, not of grief, but of anticipation. The Mustangs had moved on, leaving only fleeting glimpses in the distant hills and the memory of their hooves pressed into the soft earth. Yet their presence remained, woven into every sunrise and every hopeful breath. Eliza moved through her routines with a fresh energy. She cleaned the barn from top to bottom, swept out the old hay, repaired loose boards, and even patched the windows that had rattled loose in the last storm. Her hands, always marked by work and weather, seemed lighter. The barn, for so long just a shelter for tools and memories, began to transform, slowly at first, and then all at once, as Daisy's vision took hold. Daisy arrived every morning before the sun, carrying not only supplies, but an infectious optimism. She brought friends from the next ranch over, teenagers with strong arms and quick laughter, and even recruited a retired carpenter from town, a man with stories as old as the valley itself. Wyatt donated lumber, tools, and the stubborn kind of wisdom that could only be earned by a lifetime on the land. Together, the small crew hammered, painted, and built, the clatter and rhythm of their work echoing across the fields. The barn's interior became a place of new beginnings. Eliza swept clean the last stall, the one Ghost had called home, and filled it with fresh straw and blankets. Daisy painted a sign, her careful brush spelling out Morgan's Sanctuary in bold, welcoming letters. The paint was barely dry when the first visitors arrived, drawn by the whispers of what had happened on the ranch. They came in twos and threes at first, families with curious children, neighbors carrying baked bread, school teachers looking for a story to tell. But it was Echo, the golden-eyed foal, who brought the sanctuary to life. On the third morning after the herd's farewell, he reappeared by the fence, wild mane tangled with burrs, his presence both shy and bold. He circled the barn, nuzzled the hands of strangers, and stood quietly in the sunlight while Daisy combed out his coat. News of the wild foal spread quickly, and soon people from nearby towns made their way to the Morgan Ranch, drawn by the story of Ghost, the storm, and the healing that had followed. For Eliza, Echo became more than a symbol. Each time she saw the foal in the pasture or leaning against a visitor's shoulder, she felt her heart loosen, grief replaced by gratitude. The pain of old wounds still lingered, but it was softened by the new purpose that filled her days. She spent her mornings in the barn, feeding and tending the horses that came for shelter, and her afternoons on the porch, sharing coffee and memories with those who stopped by. As summer unfolded, the sanctuary blossomed. Wyatt, once so gruff and guarded, found himself teaching children how to mend fences and read the moods of horses. Daisy's laughter carried on the wind as she led tours, sharing the story of Ghost and the miracle of his rescue. Volunteers arrived with brushes and buckets, planting wildflowers along the paths, turning the property into a patchwork of color and promise. Even the birds seemed to sense the change, flocking to the new water troughs and nesting in the eaves. Eliza watched it all with a sense of quiet wonder. She thought often of Thomas, imagining him running alongside the Mustangs, his spirit part of every breath of wind that rippled the grass. She found herself speaking to him in the evenings, telling him about the people who had come, the lives that had been changed, and the foal who had become the heart of the sanctuary. On weekends, crowds gathered beneath the cottonwoods, sharing food, stories, and the hush of awe that fell whenever Echo appeared. Eliza opened her doors to everyone, children with wide eyes, elders with slow steps, families searching for connection. She saw in their faces the same hope that had returned to her, a belief that forgiveness and second chances were possible, even after the darkest storms. With each day, the sanctuary grew, not just as a place for wild horses, but as a space where the past could be honored and the future rebuilt. The story of Ghost spread beyond the valley, a testament to resilience and the healing that comes from facing the truth. People came to witness the Mustangs, to walk the fields where Thomas had once dreamed, and to feel the quiet magic that now lived in every blade of grass. In the golden light of late summer, Eliza stood with Daisy and Wyatt at the edge of the pasture, watching Echo graze. The land, scarred and beautiful, had become a place of healing, not just for horses, but for anyone willing to believe in hope again. The memory of loss remained, but it was no longer the final word. The sanctuary, born of storm and sorrow, had become a beacon, a reminder that even in the hardest places, something wild and wonderful could still grow. Late summer painted the Morgan Ranch in shades of gold and rust, the prairie grasses tall and swaying beneath endless blue skies. The air was sweet with wildflowers, bees humming between the new blooms planted along the fence lines. The barn doors stood wide open, sunlight spilling across the floor, illuminating dust motes that danced in the breeze. It was a place transformed, not only by the hammer and paintbrush, but by the quiet work of forgiveness and hope. Eliza stood on the porch, coffee warming her hands, watching the day begin. Visitors were already arriving, parking their cars beneath the cottonwoods, children running ahead to greet Echo at the fence. The golden-eyed foal, grown stronger and bolder each day, trotted eagerly to meet them, his mane gleaming in the early light. Laughter drifted up from the yard, mingling with the soft nickers of the horses and the distant chorus of songbirds. The land itself seemed to hum with new life. Each morning brought the ritual of tending to the horses, feeding, brushing, mending wounds both seen and unseen. Eliza worked side by side with Daisy and Wyatt, sharing the burden and the blessing of care. Wyatt taught volunteers the rhythms of ranch work, his gruff voice softened by pride as he watched the sanctuary thrive. Daisy's energy was boundless. She darted from pasture to barn to garden, her dreams for the sanctuary growing with every wildflower that bloomed. Together, they rebuilt not only fences, but the trust and community that storms, both literal and figurative, had once threatened to destroy. The sanctuary had become more than a place for horses. It was a gathering ground for memory, healing, and the quiet redemption that comes from honoring what was lost. Children learned to ride on patient mares. Old men shared stories of the valley's first Mustangs. Neighbors brought food and tools, leaving with hearts lightened by the sight of the herd grazing in the dusk. Teachers brought classrooms to witness living history, letting their students hear the tale of Ghost, the Mustang saved from the mud, the horse who had led them all to this place of second chances. In the warm evenings, Eliza would wander the pastures, the grass cool against her ankles, Echo following at her side. She would pause by the stand of cottonwoods, the place where Thomas had once watched the wild herds, his laughter echoing on the wind. The pain of his loss lingered, but it no longer hollowed her out. Instead, she carried him with her. Each gentle touch to Echo's neck, each smile given to a child, each story told in the barn was a small act of remembrance, a way of keeping her son's spirit alive in the world he had loved. As the months passed, the land continued to heal. The Mustang herd returned often, moving like shadows across the distant hills, their presence a reassurance that wildness would always have a home here. On quiet days, Eliza would spot Ghost among them, strong and whole, his coat shimmering in the sun. She would watch him lead the herd, a living testament to the endurance of spirit, the resilience that defined both horse and human. The community, too, was changed. The wounds of old grievances faded, replaced by a sense of purpose and belonging. The sanctuary drew people from beyond the valley, artists, writers, dreamers, each finding something sacred in the simple act of watching Mustangs run free. People left painted rocks at the barn door, each one inscribed with a hope or memory. Trails wound through the pastures now, lined with wildflowers and the footprints of children who would grow up knowing the importance of kindness, the weight of history, and the freedom found in forgiveness. On a golden evening near the end of summer, Eliza stood with Daisy and Wyatt at the top of the pasture. Below them, the sanctuary stretched wide and green, the barn a beacon at its heart. Echo ran with the wind, mane flying, while Ghost watched from the ridge, his herd gathered close. The sun dipped toward the horizon, casting everything in a warm, forgiving light. Eliza felt a peace she hadn't known in years, a settling, as if her soul had finally found its place in the world. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the storm, the rescue, the reckoning, the letting go. She understood, at last, that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about learning from it, building something new from the wreckage. The land bore its scars, but it was alive, seeded with hope, tended with love, and ready to nurture the next generation. As darkness fell and the stars blinked awake, Eliza, Daisy, and Wyatt remained together, watching the wild horses graze beneath the vast Montana sky. The ranch, once marked by loss, was now a place of renewal, a testament to the strength that comes from facing the truth, opening your heart, and daring to begin again. The story of Ghost, Echo, and the Morgan Sanctuary would echo for years to come. A promise written in hoofprints, in wildflowers, and in the laughter of children, as the land and its people moved forward, forever changed by one unforgettable Mustang.